Welcome into Survivor Analytics. I am your host, Clyde, and today we're going through the final part of this series, discussing who I would vote for in every final tribal council of US Survivor. We've made it to the new era seasons, many of which were covered on the Survivor Analytics podcast. I have a lot to say about these final tribals, so let's get to it. We're jumping into the new era with Survivor 41, Deshawn versus Erica versus Xander. Now, if you asked me about this final three at the time of the finale, I would not have voted for Erica. At that point, I thought that Erica was one of the luckiest winners in the history of the show. I believed that she was on the bottom of the Luvu tribe in the pre-merge. I also thought that she was saved by the Hourglass twist at the Mergatory. Post-game press completely shifted my opinion of Erica's game, and I now look at her run as a top 20 win. Deshawn revealed post-season that the attempted throne challenge by the Luvu tribe was meant to knock out Sydney, not Erica. It's also been reported post-season that Erica faced adversity at the Mergatory because she was isolated from the rest of the tribe. The Hourglass twist did more to harm Erica's game than actually help it. Looking beyond those hurdles, Erica helps orchestrate the Sham blindside at Final 8, and she runs the game from there. She creates this alliance with the likes of Ricard, Heather, and Xander that controls the back portion of the season. Towards the end, she tricks Xander into taking her to the final tribal, which is very impressive. I remember that at the time of the finale, there were many people claiming that Xander should have won the season, but I don't find his game on 41 all that great. He's positioned towards the bottom of the Yase tribe in the pre-merge, and he's probably taken out if they ever go back to tribal. In the early merge, he's positioned on the bottom as he loses many of his Yase allies like Tiffany at Final 11 and Evie at Final 9. It's also worth noting that Xander had an extra vote that he could have used to save Evie in the split tribal, but he let them go, which is pretty rough. Xander turns his game around at the Final 8 with the Sham blindside, and he's comfortably in the majority from there. While Xander deserves credit for his safety in that final stretch, many players reported postseason that Xander wasn't targeted at that point because he was perceived as an easy beat. Plus, you have Xander making the crucial mistake of bringing Erica to the final tribal, so I wouldn't vote for him. Then there's Deshawn, whose game I went down on over time. I think that Deshawn plays a very strong early game. He's in a good position in the pre-merge, running the Luvu tribe alongside Danny. Then in the early merge, he's in that majority alliance, picking off many of the Yase players. But then the Final 8 happens, where Deshawn willingly flips against the alliance of black players, and as a result, he completely loses control of the game. That move by Deshawn actively positions himself on the bottom. He's the consensus target at Final 7, where he's basically saved by the do-or-die twist. Then at Final 6, he's the backup vote in a spot where he loses his number one ally in Danny. By the Final 4, no remaining contestant wanted to ride with Deshawn to the final tribal. Even if you're not as high as me on Erica's 41 game, I think it easily clears Deshawn and Xander. She gets my vote. Then we got Survivor 42, Marianne versus Mike versus Romeo. This is a difficult decision between Marianne and Mike, but I'd lean towards Marianne. While I try to balance both the pre-merge and post-merge in my decisions, I generally place a bit more value in the late game. Over the course of 42, Marianne's game gradually improves while Mike steadily declines. Early on, Marianne is positioned towards the bottom of the Taku tribe, and she's likely voted out if they go to another tribal. That's not great, but Marianne's poor positioning is somewhat facilitated by Jackson leaving the game in the premiere. Without that situation, Marianne has another target to push in front of herself. Even in the early merge, Marianne is on the bottom, scraping by on the outside of the main power structure and surviving primarily through her relationship with Omer. Marianne's game doesn't really turn around until the Final 8, where the Taku start running the show. But that shift in power originates more from the strategic work of Omer. A key factor that elevates Marianne ahead of Mike for me is the fact that she has a tangible strategic move on her resume, that being the Omer blindside. At the Final 6, Marianne knocks out the season's best strategic player through a plurality vote. It's one of the best strategic moves by any new era winner. Then at Final 5, Marianne tricks Mike into using his idol on her, which allows Marianne to pull off that flashy move of revealing her own idol at the final tribal. On top of all that, Marianne convinces Romeo to bring her to the final tribal despite her high win equity. Marianne's late game run is one of the best stretches by any Survivor winner, which barely pushes her ahead of Mike. Mike definitely has a less turbulent game than Marianne, but it never reaches the same high points. He's in a strong position on the original Vati tribe. While he loses his ally Jenny in their first tribal council, it happens through some pretty weird circumstances, and Mike recovers from that spot, locking down a new alliance with Hai and Lydia. Then in the early merge, Mike is included in that initial majority that runs the show for 3 straight rounds. It's not until the final 8 that Mike's game falls off the rails. He's tricked by Omer into cutting Hai, which gives the Takus the numbers advantage. At final 5, he makes the crucial mistake of using his idol on Marianne. Then at final 4, he's sent into firemaking against Jonathan, who Mike could have defeated in a jury vote. So even though Mike maintains consistent agency on 42, I don't think that he makes the best decisions with that power, so I wouldn't vote for him. That leaves us with Romeo, who's in the conversation for the worst losing finalist game of the new era. In the pre-merge, he's in the majority working as Drea's second in command, but everything falls apart for him in the second half. Romeo attends 8 tribal councils in the post-merge, and he's completely out of the loop for 4 of them. To make matters worse, Romeo had connections to those players in the majority, but they chose to exclude him from their various plans. In the early merge, Drea is roped into the dominant alliance of all the big threats. Despite her working with Romeo throughout the pre-merge, she decides to leave him out of that group. Romeo finally gets back into the majority around the final 6, but it's just too little too late. Even in that position, Romeo's name is used as the backup vote in the Omer blind side. So like I said, this is a tight race between Marianne and Mike, but I'd vote for Marianne. That takes us to probably the most controversial winning game of the new era. It's Survivor 43, Cassidy versus Gabler versus Owen. I'm not high on any of these games. Survivor 43, to me, felt like one of those seasons where all of the big players cannibalized each other. You had Cody, Carla, and Jesse all going out in that final stretch, and were left with some pretty mediocre options on the table. Between these finalists, I guess I'd vote for Gabler. Owen isn't even in the conversation for my jury vote. His post-merge is a complete disaster, especially at the beginning. He's immediately positioned on the bottom, getting left out of the Ellie vote and the Dwight vote. At final 11, his name is used as the backup plan where Janine is taken out. He's then blindsided again at the final 8 where Noelle goes home. And while Owen recovers around the final 6 and works his way back into this new alliance with Cassidy and Gabler, it's just not enough for me. So I would not vote for Owen. The real debate here is whether I vote for Cassidy or Gabler. Immediately after the airing of 43, I would have said Cassidy, but my opinion of her game has went down over time. Cassidy is someone with a strong outlook on the endgame. She knew that she had the best chance against Owen and Gabler, but she's not very effective in directing the season to that point. At final 11, we see her campaigning to keep Janine in the game and failing to pull the numbers for that move. In the split tribal, she's nearly taken out by that trio of Cody, Gabler, and Jesse. Their decision was based on the result of the other split tribal, which has nothing to do with Cassidy's social or strategic gameplay. From the final 8 onwards, Cassidy knows what's going on, but she doesn't have a lot of say in those moves. It's more so Jesse and Cody calling the shots. Her biggest move of the season is probably the Carla boot at final 5, but that's also a round where Carla was clearly the biggest target, especially with Jesse immune. That leaves me with Gabler, and I wouldn't be too excited to vote for him, but I think that he plays the best holistic game of these finalists. His premiere is ridiculous as he tells the rest of the tribe that he plans on using his shot in the dark in their first tribal council, but Gabler turns his game around at the Mergatory, where he's the leader of the Ellie vote. Gabler has a tangible strategic move on his resume, which is something that I cannot say about Owen or Cassidy. Gabler is then excluded from the Dwight vote at final 12, which is not great, but he recovers from that round by aligning with the pair of Jesse and Cody. That trio dictates a large chunk of the post-merge, and while Gabler holds the least amount of agency in that alliance, he's still working at the center of the power structure. So of these finalists, I'd say that Cassidy is the best overall player, but with my jury vote, I'd go with Gabler. Moving on to Survivor 44, it's Carolyn versus Heidi versus Jam Jam. I'll cast my vote for the actual winner of the season. Jam Jam plays the best game of these 3 by a solid margin. I remember that around the time of the finale of 44, there were people saying that Carolyn deserved the win over Jam Jam, and I just don't see it at all. Carolyn and Jam Jam worked together for just about the entire season, and in the pre-merge, Carolyn actually outplays Jam Jam. She's a part of that move with Josh that cuts Sarah out of the game against Jam Jam's wishes. The second half of the season really tips the scale in favor of Jam Jam. We see that Tika 3 alliance operating the middle between the Soka and Ratu tribes, and I think that Jam Jam is much more instrumental to the success of that group. He's connecting with people like Heidi and Jamie, which enables the Tikas to dismantle the other power structures. Carolyn also makes alliances outside the Tika 3, but they're undermined by Jam Jam. In the early merge, Carolyn locks down an alliance with Franny. Then at Final 8, Jam Jam and Carson go behind Carolyn's back and cut Franny anyway. There's never a round in the post-merge of 44 where Carolyn gets a leg up over Jam Jam. It felt like she was more so taken through the game than actively carving her own path. At the final 6, we see Jam Jam and Carson playing the middle where they elect to cut Jamie over Carolyn. While it's impressive that Carolyn developed those bonds that helped her survive that round, it still reveals some poor positioning on her end. So I think that Jam Jam deserved to win this season, but I will say that Carolyn probably deserves second place. I think that she plays a much better game than Heidi, who was out of the loop for a good stretch of the post-merge. At Final 8, she unnecessarily flips on her ally Danny in a spot where no one else was looking to vote out Danny. She then rebuilds her alliance with Danny and loses him in the following round. In that last section of the game, Heidi is just working towards the strategic interests of the Tikas without ever fully gaining their trust. By the final 4, I don't think that any of those Tikas actually wanted to take her to the end. So like I said, my jury vote would go to Jam Jam. Then it's Survivor 45, Austin versus D versus Jake. I'd vote for D here. I look at D as the best overall player from the new era with the best winning game. With that said, I feel that Austin is sometimes underrated as a losing finalist. Prior to the final 7, Austin has a slightly better game than D. They're both members of that Reba 4 alliance that runs the pre-merge. At the swap, we see Austin connecting with Emily and pulling her over to the Reba's side. By picking up Emily as a loyal ally, the Rebas dominate those early merge rounds, picking off the likes of Kelly, Kendra, and Bruce. That Kelly vote in particular is one that D did not want to see through, and she strong-armed into it by the pair of Austin and Drew. For me, it's the final stretch of 45 that elevates D ahead of Austin. At Final 7, she helps orchestrate the Emily blindside, a move that undermines Austin by cutting one of his closest allies, while also setting up D with more paths to the final tribal. Going into the final 6, D had Austin, Drew, and Julie all working to take her to the end in a spot where she probably beats any of them in a jury vote. D then goes behind Austin's back in gathering the numbers against Drew. Now, it's worth acknowledging that D is not as safe as Austin in her navigation through the season. She's nearly taken out at Final 5 if not for Katurah getting paranoid at the last second in the voting booth. She's also a top target at Final 4 where she's likely thrown into fire making without the immunity necklace. So even though D struggles in terms of threat level management, Austin never weaponizes that aspect of her game against her. Jake made it to this final 3 as well. He was my preseason winner pick for 45, but I think that he has one of the worst losing finalist games of the new era. Jake is a player with many correct strategic reads, but he just doesn't have the social capital to actually make those moves happen. In the post-merge of 45, Jake is shown constantly failing to achieve his desired outcome. In the split tribal, he can't save his new ally Caleb. At Final 10, his Bello allies turn against him, and he's out of the loop for the Kelly vote. At Final 8, his name is used as the backup plan in the Bruce elimination. Through all of this, Jake remains self-aware. He knows that he will need some kind of flashy play to impress the jury, and he almost pulls off that move at the Final 5. In that round, he protects Katurah with an idol, and they theoretically have the numbers to take out D, only for Katurah to mess it up at the 11th hour. I think that Jake is a better player than his performance on 45 may suggest, but with my jury vote, I'm rolling with D, and it's not that close. Then we got Survivor 46, Ben versus Charlie versus Kenzie. When we covered this season on the Survivor Analytics podcast, I was adamant that Charlie deserved the win, and a year later, I stand by that opinion. Charlie pulls off one of the best losing finalist games in the history of the show, one where he perfects the art of positioning through his active gameplay. I know that the common criticism of Charlie's run on 46 is that he simply hid behind Maria, but I don't think that's true. Rather, it's the opposite. In the pre-merge, we see Charlie bonding with the men of the original Sega tribe while Maria connects with the women. When Sega finally attends a tribal council in episode 5, it's Charlie getting his way. He convinces Maria to not only flip on the women, but also use her extra vote in the process. Essentially, Charlie dupes Maria into cutting her secondary allies, while he keeps his other pawns in the game, like Ben. Throughout the merge, Charlie is a pivotal strategic figure, working in the majority alliance. He makes conscious efforts to align with players outside his original group, while also propping up Maria as this big threat to be taken out later in the game. At Final 8, Charlie allows Maria to take the lead on the Tiffany vote, knowing that it will peak her threat level in the process. That decision, combined with Charlie's broad connections, pay major dividends at the Final 6. In that round, Maria attempts to turn on Charlie, only for him to gather the numbers against her ally Q. On top of all of Charlie's strategic achievements, he plays a solid social game. When Ben wins the final immunity challenge, he decides to bring Charlie to the end due to the bond that they developed on the island. Even though I'd vote for Charlie, I still look at Kenzie as a middle-tier winner of Survivor. In my latest winner ranking, I put Kenzie in my section dominance tier for her work in the pre-merge. Kenzie runs the original Yanu tribe alongside Tiffany, as they knock out the likes of Jelinski, Jess, and Banu. It's worth acknowledging the impact of the random medevac on Kenzie's game. In episode 3, Yanu loses its third consecutive immunity challenge, and they're about to attend Tribal Council until Randon is pulled from the game for a back injury. This is important because Yanu loses immunity in the next episode. Without that medevac, Kenzie attends a Tribal Council with Tiffany and Q, where Tiffany is the player operating the middle. I don't know who Tiffany votes out in that spot, but Kenzie is in serious danger. Then in the post-merge, Kenzie is initially a member of the majority, voting out some of the Nami contestants. She plays a key role in the Hunter blindside, as Hunter claims post-season that he did not use his idol due to his trust in Kenzie. But then you get to the final 8, where Kenzie is blindsided by the Tiffany vote, losing her number 1 ally. From there, she navigates into that majority alliance with Charlie, Liz, and Ben that runs the endgame, but I never felt that Kenzie was the head strategic figure of that group. Most people will remember Kenzie, the Survivor winner, for her social game, but even that aspect of her resume is a bit overrated. At Final 4, Ben takes Charlie to the final tribal over Kenzie. It felt like Kenzie's social prowess never materialized in legitimate agency. Of these finalists, Ben is the last person who I would vote for. There's never a round on Survivor 46 where Ben seizes control of the game. For most of the season, Ben is cruising round to round, working as a strategic follower of Charlie. Despite that stable alliance, Ben still stumbles through multiple tribal councils. He's blindsided by the Tim vote in the split tribal. Then in the early merge, he's in the majority alliance, but he's positioned towards the periphery of that group. Then at Final 7, Ben is roped into the plan to cut Venus, but at Tribal Council, he inexplicably throws his vote onto Kenzie. Ben later admits that this vote was an accident, and Kenzie calls him out for it. So for me, Ben was too passive in his navigation through the season. I'm casting my jury vote for Charlie. We can move on to Survivor 47. It's Rachel versus Sam versus Sue. In this scenario, I'd vote for Sam, but it's close. I see this final 3 as one of the weakest of the new era. This is brought up in the finale, but Survivor 47 is one of those seasons where there wasn't really a dominant alliance running the game. Players were constantly moving in and out of the majority, so you end up with this weird final 3 where none of the contestants feel like consistent strategic forces. All of them are absolutely blindsided at some point in the season, and all of those blindsides came at the expense of their number 1 allies. Going down the line, Rachel loses Annika in the pre-merge, Sam loses Sierra at Final 11, and even Sue loses Gabe at the Final 9. I know people won't like it, but I wouldn't vote for Rachel here. For me, there's just too many tribal councils where Rachel has no clue what's going on. On top of losing Annika, Rachel's on the outs for the Sierra vote and the Operation Italy Tribal Council. The times where Rachel gains agency on the season, it's more through advantages rather than her social gameplay. Her big move of knocking out Andy at the Final 6 is one that fully depends on an idol. On top of that, she completely mismanages her threat level in the endgame to the point where she needs individual immunity every round starting at the Final 7. It's just a rough ride for Rachel, and I think that there's an argument for Rachel having the worst strategic game of these 3. Compare Rachel to Sue. I think that Sue had a much stronger early game where she's in the main power structure on the Tuku tribe. Then in the early merge, Sue is in the majority as Rachel is losing some of her tightest allies like Sierra and Saul. The issue with Sue is the back half of her game where everything kind of falls apart. She loses her two closest allies in Gabe and Caroline, and after those losses, she kind of just latches onto Rachel, who's already on the bottom. The other big factor to point out with Sue is that she never appeared highly respected in her various alliances. I never got the sense that Sue was the directing force of any particular vote. Postseason, she takes credit for the Andy blindside, but I see that as a move led more by Rachel because they needed her idol. On the positive side, I'd credit Sue for her safety within the game, where outside that first Tuku Tribal Council, she is never seriously targeted. I'd say that Sue had the cleanest route to the end, but it's also the least dominant of these three. That takes us to Sam, who barely squeaks out my jury vote. Sam's pre-merge game is probably the best here. In the second Gada Tribal Council, Sam is the lead strategist pulling Andy and Sierra together to vote out Annika. That's a clear instance of Sam straight up outplaying Rachel. Like the other players, his game shatters in the post-merge. He's pretty powerless between the final 11 and final 8. His name is used as the backup vote in the Sierra blindside, but at final 7, he's in on the Operation Italy Tribal Council, taking Caroline out of the game. Now, I generally credit Andy the most for that move, but Sam was still a factor in that vote, and it's the best strategic play of the entire season. That tribal council also marked the second time where Sam got the best of Rachel, which plays into this decision as well. I just feel that Sam's high points on 47 are the most impressive, and his low points were never so disastrous to the extent that he needed immunity, so Sam would get my vote. Finally, the most recent Final Tribal Council on Survivor, it's Survivor 48, Eva versus Joe versus Kyle. As this season was airing, I was very high on Joe's game, but looking back, I'd actually vote for Kyle. My original problem with Kyle's run was that he was never as out in front as the likes of Joe and Eva. To me, Joe felt like the glue of that strong players alliance that dominated the post-merge. Joe was the figure keeping people like David, Eva, and Kyle loyal through multiple rounds where they theoretically could have flipped against him. I still consider Joe the architect of that alliance, but I look at Kyle as the real strategic mastermind of that group. Kyle correctly identifies Joe and Eva as the figureheads of the strong players, and he actively convinces them to make strategic decisions that advance his game more than their own. At the final 9, he tricks them into flipping on David, who was fully loyal to that pair and despised by the jury. He was the optimal person for Joe and Eva to drag to the final tribal council, and instead they vote him out and keep Kyle's number 1 ally Camilla in the game. Later on at the final 6, Kyle convinces that duo to turn on Shaheen, who also intended on riding with them into the endgame. That move positioned Kyle and Camilla perfectly at the final 5, where they could play the middle. Kyle's game on 48 is one where he holds a lot of strategic agency while simultaneously avoiding the target. He seriously targeted just one time in the swap section of the game, where to be fair he needs an idol, but at the same time, that round is surrounded by unlucky circumstances. Plus, we gotta remember that Kyle actually wanted the votes to land on him in that tribal council so that he could counter them with an idol. So that round isn't a major knock in my assessment of his game. The biggest negative with Kyle's run on 48 for me is his positioning at the final 4. Kyle more than likely loses a jury vote to Camilla had she won the final immunity challenge. Plus, every other player at that point in the season intended on throwing Kyle into fire making. Now, I'll credit Kyle for his killer instinct in the endgame, as he was willing to put Camilla into fire, but it's still not great that there was a legitimate losing combination on the board for him. As for Joe and Eva, their games share many of the same strengths and weaknesses. I mentioned the David and Shaheen boots earlier, which are blemishes on both of their resumes. Between them, I'd say that Eva plays the slightly stronger social game, but Joe has the better strategic performance. Joe lost a lot of respect from the jury with with his constant focus on the principles of honor and integrity. In retrospect, I think that some of Joe's strategic agency on 48 originated from the fact that everyone knew that he could not win a jury vote. Still, I think that Joe had more sway in the strategic decisions of that partnership, even when those decisions were occasionally misguided. But anyways, Kyle plays the most optimal strategic game of these three, so he earns my jury vote. So there it is, my picks for every Final Tribal Council of US Survivor. If you followed along with this series, thank you so much for your support. Make sure that you follow Survivor Analytics on all platforms, where we cover 3 seasons of the show per year. I also release a player ranking for each of those seasons. If you want to see more long-form rankings like this, let me know some of your ideas in the comments section below. But again, thank you so much for listening.